This B Podcast Network show is presented by IXL. IXL's all-inclusive online teaching and learning platform simplifies edtech needs and accelerates achievement in 95 of the top 100 U.S. school districts. IXL delivers personalized learning across a comprehensive pre-K-12 curriculum, including math, language arts, science, and social studies, and it helps you assess student performance through actionable real-time insights at every level of your school or district. This one solution performs work that typically requires dozens of different tools. Want to find out why so many leading districts trust IXL? Visit ixl.com/BE. That's ixl.com/BE. We're proud to be sponsored by MyFlex Learning. MyFlex Learning is a scheduling platform that helps middle and high schools meet the individual needs of all students. Schools can easily create and manage time for flex blocks, win time, activity periods, RTI, counselor and teacher appointments, and much more. And with its built-in accountability tool and reporting features, MyFlex Learning solves your challenges around getting kids where they need to be and understanding how flex time is spent. Make your flex time work for you. Visit myflexlearning.com/BE to learn more and receive $500 off the first year. That's myflexlearning.com/BE. Welcome in, everybody. You are listening once again to the Authority Podcast on the B Podcast Network. So pleased to have you joining us today for this conversation. My guest is Mandy Froehlich. Mandy is an experienced director of innovation and technology integrator and teacher. Her interest lies in reinvigorating and re-engaging teachers back into their profession, as well as what's needed to support teachers in their pursuit of innovative and divergent thinking and teaching. So whatever role you play in schools, there's going to be a lot here to think about. Mandy is the author of a number of books, including Reignite the Flames, published by EduMatch, which we're discussing today. Mandy, welcome to the Authority.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So the subtitle there on the book is Finding Our Passion and Purpose for Learning Among the Embers. I kind of wanted to unpack that a little bit to start and really start with those embers. I mean, what does that look like? What are they? When we're talking about this phenomenon of burnout, right? And what it looks like in individual educators or inside schools, what are we talking about?
Yeah. Well, I always thought that it was an appropriate visual as a fire starts to go. If you ever had a campfire, it starts to go out and it kind of gets lower, and then all that's left are those burning embers.
Right.
But what's interesting about embers in a fire is that if you throw another piece of wood on or you throw some paper on, it can relight itself. And so that's really what the book is trying to look at. Like, it's trying to look at, we have such a close emotional tie to education when we work in education, more so than many other professions, with the exception of maybe doctors and nurses. We have a very close emotional tie. It's different than, say, an accountant or somebody who provides customer service on the end of a line. Like, it's not the same type of thing. And so what makes teaching and working in schools just a little bit different when it comes to burnout is that it's an emotional transition that happens. It's not that we just don't like our jobs, it's that our entire purpose and our entire tie to our profession has dwindled or gone away or started to sever. So that's really what the embers are talking about. It's like, when it comes down that far, how do we throw that piece of paper in or throw the extra wood on the fire? Who helps us with that, and how do we get the fire burning again for our work?
Yeah, and continuing on that point, as you mentioned, it being this emotional transition, there's a part of one of uh, the book quote testimonials where there's an educator who writes that the book came into her life when she was confused, lost, and heartbroken. Right, which is obviously an emotional language and not something that's always associated with professional concerns, even when we talk about
Yeah.
burnout or being disillusioned, disenchanted, all these things, but to really feel like that sense of that broken heart. And I think it's even worth a little further discussion of what makes educators predisposed to burnout in these ways. And because it's worth recognizing among those who can support them, right? Administrators, others, to see, okay, what are the factors that are leading to not just professional burnout, but really that holistic sense of personally feeling depleted.
Yeah, and educators, like, when people go into education, they go in with this, just for a lot of people, this unrivaled amount of empathy for other people, this a feeling like they're trying to make a difference in the world. They've considered other professions that make a difference in the world, and they've settled on teaching. And I think that those types of people who do a lot of things for other people, who are typically people pleasers, who usually don't have a lot of boundaries because they're just willing to do for everybody else before they do for themselves, when education gets into a state as it's gotten. And to be honest, like, my adventure with burnout started 10 years ago. So it's not like the pandemic has been the only thing. We just weren't willing to talk about it before because it is a really emotionally charged profession. And so those types of people, when they're in the spots where they're doing for other people, and society in general is going through this rather difficult transition with a lot of things going on, and they feel that empathy, and they're working in these schools, they can go through a few things that cause them to disengage. And they're all listed in Reignite the Flames. They're, personal adversity. So something happens at home, there's a sickness, you're taking care of aging parents, there's something going on. Professional adversity. There's teacher trauma, which I've defined as being things that are very specific to teaching that happen that can cause trauma to teachers. So things like active shooting drills, different kinds of abuses from students and parents, whether that be verbal or physical. So those types of things, that's teacher trauma. And we have secondary traumatic stress, which has always been a big thing in education, but especially during the pandemic, when we see difficult things and traumas happening over and over to people, or we hear about them, that can cause us to have symptoms of PTSD. And again, that heightened during the pandemic for teachers who were then able to see into their students' houses and see some of the things going on that they had only heard about before. Let's see, we have burnout, which of course we've spoken about, demoralization. We have different, like, complex post-traumatic stress disorder from social injustices like racism and discrimination against the LGBTQ community, and just a stigma response to mental health, people with mental health issues. All of those things can also contribute to burnout or contribute to a disengagement. And so there's a lot of reasons why people can disengage. And so part of the struggle with that is that there is not one way to help them. There's not one thing that an administrator can do. And that's been, I think, frustrating for administrators who really truly do have a desire to help. They want that one quick answer, and it's not there because it's very personal. And so, yeah, so that's been, again, that's just been really one of the struggles, I think, in trying to help people in this profession.
In my work, I've collaborated directly with hundreds of educators to support their success. Do you know which of their edtech frustrations comes up time and again? The sheer number of tools out there and the difficulty of knowing which ones schools like theirs are using to get results. IXL is different. Not only does it perform the functions of dozens of tools, it's currently delivering results for 1 in 4 U.S. students, including those in 95 of the top 100 districts. Another major pain point that comes up: when a school is excited to implement a new tool only to find out the teachers hate it. Yikes. It helps to know that IXL is loved and trusted by more than 1 million teachers, saving them time on prep work while enabling them to better support student learning. IXL is research proven to accelerate achievement. Studies across 45 states show that IXL schools outperform non-IXL schools on state assessments. And independent research from Johns Hopkins University verifies that IXL meets ESSA Tier 1 standards. With those results combined with IXL's teacher-friendly reputation, what more could you ask for? If you have a goal to increase achievement for all students, make sure to find out what IXL can do for you. Visit ixl.com/BE for a demo. That's ixl.com/BE. Going back also to, we talk about finding our passion and purpose, right? This is a profession and a vocation, right, in which there's an assumption that passion and purpose are present, that people who choose to go into education are aligned to, bought into the purpose of that work, have a parent, and that in turn, right, that assumption and expectation leads to the adverse effects when those things are being trampled upon, right? Versus there are
Hmm.
plenty of jobs out there where either there's not a strong expectation of those things, or maybe the passion is something outside of the actual position. It's passion for money. It's
Hmm.
not that I love
Sure.
what I do, but I love what it gets me, kind of thing, right? There's a variety of different, but in here in particular, right, it's very specific. And in so many ways, like when you think about what educators, the deck is stacked against being able to consistently achieve the results that would be truly fulfilling, right? There's
Hmm.
so many factors that make it difficult to ensure that every student is really succeeding, and what that looks like, and all of the criticisms and things that it's
Hmm.
like, okay, it's almost unavoidable to face some of the, and then you stack on top things like you said, active shooter drill, right? Whereas in some cases we hear some of these terminologies like trauma, secondary traumatic stress, and it may sound, but realistically,
Hmm.
like these are, should not be normal things, that this is a part of somebody's day-to-day, students included
Right.
and teachers, right? That this is just part of what we do now, is
Hmm.
we prepare. So how is there anything, I guess, that comes to mind that could be done better preventatively ahead of time, to say, okay, obviously, once we've made a routine of going through some of these things, there's going to be adverse effects. Are there things we could be better rethinking at the beginning to say, can it just not happen in the first place?
Yeah. And you hit on something that I've heard a lot. I had heard prior to the pandemic too, but during the pandemic, it was really hit hard. And it was that idea of finding your why. And I believe in that, obviously. Talk about purpose, it's kind of the same thing, follows along those lines. But I think what people are finding is that it's not that they don't know or forgot their why, it's that they can't. And so that's very frustrating as well when you feel like, okay, I defined this purpose. It's a good purpose. It's a human based purpose. It's something that's going to make the world better. And I can't do it here. And then to have it be something where people are coming back and saying, find your why. And you're thinking, I didn't lose it. I can't do it. And so that's actually something that I think is someplace that you could start. Like, is are the things that are happening in your school or in your district, are they actually aligned to what would be a purpose for education? Or like we've gotten into in some states, and even in Wisconsin, we have open enrollment. And so districts have almost gotten to where they're marketing and it's this weird commercial space. Like, and is that what we want to do? Is that where we are right now, where we want to spend money and spend manpower marketing our districts? Like, is that a thing? Or is it that we really need to, turn around and see where else we could be spending our time and our resources when we just don't have a lot of them? So things like that. Also, I mean, there's things the district can do to help support from the standpoint of that they're very tangible and very logistical, things like taking a look at the insurance. And when I talk to districts, a lot of people say, well, our insurance covers mental health services and things, but what do they cover, and is it after deductible? Because that's usually what it is. So they usually have some high deductible. They're giving back, maybe their $5,000 deductible, they're giving back 2,500 on your HSA or whatever it is, but the person still has to pay $2,500 and that people can't afford that. This is the kicker. And then they might only okay 10 sessions or something. Well, if you're really struggling and you need to see somebody every week or bi-weekly, that money adds up fast and the sessions add up fast. That's not even going to get you through half the year. And so when you start to look at things like that, what are you actually doing for people? You're telling them to get help, but then you're putting them in a spot of spending a lot of money and potentially not getting the services that they actually need. And so how can we like push our insurances to really make sure that they're covering the things that we need, that somehow there's a plan where things like really important things like mental health is covered 100% from day one. And there are outside companies. I had spoken with one about 6 months ago. That's what they do. That's their entire job, is to backfill those mental health pieces that are usually lacking with insurances. And so when people say, I don't know where to start, I would say start with the tangible, start with the things that you can see, because emotions and burnout and demoralization and all these things, they feel very abstract. And so you need to start with the things that you know you can change and see on paper. And then that will lead you down the road to help some of the other things that are a little bit more abstract.
Right. And you said those tangibles, and there's a lot of these things when we talk about living and finding your why and executing on that why, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are realities that for some people make it impractical. Like it's not even a matter of I feel like I'm not succeeding, or I'm feeling isolated from my why. It's I literally can't afford to do this job because I can't
Right.
pay the rent in the city where I live, or
Yeah.
something like that, right? It's not a practical reality that I can live the why that I still believe in because I can't manage the rest of my life. Things like that
Yeah.
that are, and we should want educators to believe strongly in that why. There's every
Mm-hmm.
now and then it seems as though it's treated as a privilege to get to have a why, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There's
Yep.
sort of an outdated,
Mm-hmm.
archaic view on the economy and the workplace, where it's like you just do what you have to do, and living towards some greater purpose. That's you shouldn't expect that, but that's what this is. Right? I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
we want to do the best possible job of educating kids, something that's not going to be an easy job and that requires a lot of sustained effectiveness and perseverance, the system should protect that why and
Mm-hmm.
find ways to make sure that it is honored, and on the other side of it, that it's not used cudgel, I guess, right? To say, well, you're not
Mm-hmm.
allowed to care about other things because this is the only
Mm-hmm.
reason why you're here. And part of that probably gets to that starting point of educators giving themselves forgiveness for the
Mm-hmm.
feelings that they're having, whether it's
Yeah.
burnout,
Mm-hmm.
disengagement, demoralization, whatever, to say, you're not if there's nothing wrong with you feeling what you're feeling because it's all authentic to you, and the starting point in trying to kind of reverse it or heal with it is understanding that it's happening, why it's happening,
Mm-hmm.
and what you might do from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another, to add on to what you're saying is that it's really difficult sometimes for people to use the word healing when it comes to work. It feels weird. Why would you have to heal for work? And I think as we move forward, I've kind of said like that's a space that I believe that we're actively moving into, is for people to understand that like healing happens in a lot of different ways, and it has to be recognized in a lot of different ways. So we think of healing as things like, well, I went through a traumatic experience as a child and I now have to heal from that, or I was abused by my spouse and I now have to heal from that, or I lost my mother and now I have to heal from that. But also like disengaging from a job that is so closely tied to your identity, like for most educators, if I say, who are you? They'll say, well, I'm a wife, a mom, and a teacher. Or I'm a I'm a brother, son, and I'm a dog dad, and I'm a teacher. Like it's very closely related to their identity. And so when something is that related to identity and you start to disengage from it, there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of hurt. You almost go through like like a grief, like a cycle of grief. And it's difficult to relate healing and job. That doesn't feel right. And yet that's exactly what it is. And so, yeah, we have to be able to first like recognize what's happening. We have to learn about what it is about ourselves, be very self-aware, grow our own emotional, kind of EQ, our own emotional knowledge about ourselves. And then we need to be able to implement that and heal over time in order to kind of re-engage that piece again.
Right. And again, I think the healing piece illustrates the still ongoing lack of clarity, lack of consistent understanding of mental health versus physical health,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because clearly there's
Yeah.
a variety of profession. I'll use sports for an example where if somebody has a broken leg or a torn rotator cuff, their employer is going to want them to heal because
Mm-hmm.
if they tried to perform with that injury, they would be totally ineffective and they wouldn't be helping
Mm-hmm.
anybody. And
Yeah.
eventually it would become so painful that they would just quit entirely and probably be
Mm-hmm.
beyond healing at that point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
why is that
Yeah.
any different with a stress or mental or emotional related injury, right? To say
Mm-hmm.
that if you're not whole in that way, you're not going to be as effective, and it's
Mm-hmm.
only going to chip away so far until you're going to permanently disengage from the situation.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And like in the case of teacher attrition, like that was the big question I was getting asked during the pandemic. Like, how do we stop teacher attrition? And I said, if they're leaving, it's too late. Because when you take people who are so emotionally connected to a job and they have gone through years of education, years of learning and hours of teaching that they weren't really paid for, and they choose to actually leave that job, they have already emotionally disengaged from what they're doing. And so the attrition isn't actually the problem. The emotional engagement that happened prior to it is. And so, actually, the best thing that you can do is if people are to the point where they're leaving, is you can say, you know what? I'm so glad you made this choice for you because obviously this would be a really difficult choice. I hope that you go out there and you heal and you decide to come back
mhm.
instead of making them feel guilty and bad for the choice that they feel like they have to make. And then they leave and they never come back to teaching. And because there's so much guilt that accompanies that anyway, that nobody needs more of that. So I think even the attitude that we move forward with when it comes to teachers who have left the profession, that needs to change as well.
Right. And that's also not going to be very helpful toward balance the
Yes,
profession, right?
right.
When they can see it from that side and see, okay, there's clearly an unhealthy dynamic here. There's there's a harsh attitude toward people making decisions that they have to make, and this just
Mm-hmm.
seems to be the cycle of things. Well, maybe I want to avoid that entirely, which is a problem because
Mm-hmm.
we really need people in this profession. And so, in this book, and it's Reigniting the Flame. So of course, a lot of it's about that re-engagement piece of those
Mm-hmm.
who are disengaged, which comes after, hopefully at the beginning, there was some engagement to begin with, right? Like what does that kind of cycle look like of, particularly if we're thinking about maybe actions administrators can be doing, or the kind of culture that we want to build when we're trying to create that engagement in the first place, and then being aware of what's going on and seeing those opportunities for that re-engagement. But I'm thinking maybe viewing that as a continuous cycle of trying to
Mhm.
create and maintain and reinforce the engagement in the profession, and just understanding that there's a lot of things that make it challenging, but staying tuned into it to try to take appropriate action.
Yeah, and that's a huge part of it is that awareness piece and knowing how you're feeling at almost all times. And one thing I often suggest is to do some emotional tracking. And so whether it's daily or weekly, just it can be as simple as using like a smiley face system and notating what happened during that week that made you feel a certain way. And over time, you may see that around March, you're always kind of feeling yuck. And just to recognize that as something that it is and to be more proactive about it. But really understanding how you feel is one part of that. To me, there's two pieces of reengagement. The first is the systemic issues that happen in the culture issues that are typically present in a school where there's a lot of disengaged teachers. That takes a really strong will, honestly, by the entire staff to be able to recognize that in an appropriate way and make plans to try to change it. What will probably happen is as they incrementally move down to improving the climate and culture, the people who struggle and who cannot maintain that level of positivity around them, they're going to start to leave. And that's not a bad thing. I think we think of people leaving buildings or moving buildings or districts as a bad thing. It's not, because that may not have been the right place for them. And they might go to another place that actually they find is much better for them and is more on just fills a gap that they were feeling at their previous place. So it doesn't have to be a bad thing or a negative thing. It can actually be a really good thing because then that school is moving forward and they're, refilling positions with people that fit into that climate and culture. And so that's one piece of it. The other piece is the personal individual piece. And that piece is the harder one for schools because they can't force anybody to heal. That person has to decide on their own that they want to do it. Then they have to have enough emotional intelligence to understand what they need, whether that's going and seeing a counselor, whether that's practicing self care, which has got a bad rap, but is truly a way that you do heal. Whether that's stepping away from the position for a little while and taking some time, or maybe just staying in schools but changing positions, like that person has to be able to figure out what it is that they need. And so those two pieces have to be working in tandem. And if you have a lot of people in a school that are not engaged and somebody is trying to re-engage, honestly, the best thing that they can do for themselves is find a different school because it's more important that person take steps to help themselves heal than it is to continually live in a space that doesn't serve you anymore. And so those are sort of two things that are going on at once. And so I'm not sure I fully answered your question, but there's just so many pieces
Right,
to it
right.
that people have to recognize. And then you also have to think about like the individual, do they have people around them, surrounding them who are supportive and things
Mhm.
as well. Staying engaged is definitely a ongoing process. And I've kind of joked that like it reminds me very much of being married. You first get into a marriage or into education and you're excited and it's fun and everybody's like, if my husband leaves a fork in the sink, I'm like, oh, that's okay. He's amazing. He's great. We just got married. The fork's not a problem. And then 8 years in, I'm like, if you leave a fork in the sink one more time, it's that kind
Mhm.
of a thing. And education can kind of be like that too. If you're not careful, and you're not putting the time and energy into a marriage or into your relationship with your work, both things can happen. It can start to feel irritating after a while. And so watching it over time, knowing that even me and what I know about emotional engagement, I've burnt out and become demoralized several times over the course of my career. The difference being that I could recognize it sooner and I had the strategies to use to do something about it. And so that's really what you're trying to build.
And now a quick break for a word from our sponsor, MyFlex Learning. Let's talk about flex time in schools. The potential benefits to our students make it totally worth exploring. There's more time for personalized learning, increased choice and agency for students, and the increased engagement that comes along with it, dedicated time for intervention, and overall, as school leaders, it provides you and your faculty more tools to increase academic achievement. But the implementation and management of flex time can be a challenge. Tricky logistics and a lack of clear accountability systems can prevent teachers from buying in. It can hold you back from ensuring students make good use of their time. That's why I'm pleased to share that MyFlex Learning provides a solution to these challenges and more. MyFlex Learning helps you create and manage flexible time for any purpose. And with the seamless SIS integration, a student locator, flexible daily rostering, and intuitive mobile app, it eliminates the common challenges of implementation and management. If you want to see for yourself, visit myflexlearning.com/BE to learn more and receive $500 off the first year of use. That's myflexlearning.com/BE. You'll learn all about MyFlex Learning, what it can do for your school, and you'll receive a $500 off offer for your first year. Check it out. You referenced a couple of times with the support system or the people around you, and that goes both ways, and that's why it's so critical. One of the reasons, at least, why it's so critical for this to be addressed at the organizational level, because it's contagious, right? It's
Hmm.
contagious when there's a positive culture, and
Hmm.
it's contagious in the reverse. And one of the types of disengagement, and you can describe how this is different from other types, but I mean, one of the ones that to me stands out as like the most contagious, and it can sweep right through, is the demoralization piece, because it's almost
Hmm.
like demoralization. This is going to be a clunky way to describe it, but it's sort of like the opposite of burnout. You talked about the embers, right? And everything is kind of burning down, and the embers are still there, and that's that purpose piece, right? And you're burning out, you're burnt,
Hmm.
and you're just okay. There's nothing like I'm kind of exhausted. I need to reignite this. To me, the demoralization is like the fire is burning. You're going through the motions, but there's no like there's nothing underneath it. So as soon as it gets
Hmm.
extinguished, oh, we can't relight this fire because there was nothing, right? Like I no
Yeah.
longer believed in the purpose of what I was doing or in my organization's ability to achieve
Hmm.
that purpose. So I can kind of go through the motions for a while I
Hmm.
think about something else I want to do, or just because whatever, right? But
Yeah.
once
Yeah.
that starts sweeping around and I start looking at my colleagues and we start
Hmm.
realizing, hey, none of us really believe in what we're doing anymore, that seems to me to be even more contagious than anything else. Much of this is, if you're not necessarily experiencing it personally, you might not get it secondhand, but that piece, again,
Yeah. Yeah.
positively contagious and negatively
Hmm.
contagious depending on how it's going.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, demoralization is kind of like, this is probably going to be a terrible analogy, but it's like having a fire and wanting to cook a hot dog and putting the hot dog in the fire. The fire doesn't do anything to it. Like,
Right, right.
it's like the fire just does not work. And so, for those of you listening, demoralization is you feel this need to make a difference in what you're doing, and something is challenging that so that you don't feel like you're making a difference anymore. So the pandemic is a super easy example, but like Ross is saying, it can spread through a school very quickly through things like even test scores. I think test scores are kind of low hanging fruit when it comes to demoralization, because you have your entire staff in there. The staff has been in a meeting, they've been working really hard, and somebody comes in and says, hey, we're at the bottom of the barrel in the state. Like, our test scores are the lowest in the state. Like, what are we going to do? And you feel like, well, I've been working so hard and nothing I'm doing is working. And so I'm not making a difference anymore. Maybe I just need to get out of education because that's what I came here. And I've often related demoralization again to an identity issue. Where you felt like you made a difference before is not necessarily you don't feel like you're doing that anymore, even though you are. Like it's still happening. You're still making that difference in other ways, but you don't see it. And so sometimes we need to start identifying in a different way in order to be able to find, like, in order to do the remoralization again. So I'll give you an example. I had worked with a teacher in Texas and she was awesome, loved her. And I had actually started working with her on some technology integration things. That's what I was there for. And when I talked to her, I said, "Why did you join the program to the group to do the technology integration stuff?" And she said, "To be honest, because I'm not sure why I'm teaching anymore. And I really thought that potentially this would help me out." And so she was doing great things, not only in her classroom, but also for herself to be able to recognize that and take on something new, even in that state. That was fantastic. Like she really was trying. And so, as I spoke to her more, I found out that she really identified with this very specific way that she taught literacy. She was a middle school literacy teacher. And the district had just purchased a very canned curriculum that she was expected to follow that didn't jive with the way she had taught literacy in the past. So she felt she was a really good literacy teacher because she taught literacy this way. But
Mhm.
now she had to teach it a different way. And that really sort of battled against her identity that she had in that way she taught literacy. So I discussed demoralization with her and I told her, what it was. And so that's really like the first step is understanding what's happening. And I said, it's like, we need to potentially, we can lean into this ed tech stuff. Absolutely. Like finding another sort of niche in your teaching is definitely one way to do that. Another thing that we can do though is that we can see if we can try to figure out within this canned curriculum, how can you use some of those teaching strategies you were using before and sort of migrate them into that canned curriculum. And, so working kind of that idea of that freedom within fences, we know what our constraints are. So how can we take what we know we do well and mesh it with those constraints? And, she found that it really was like that demoralization was a big part. And as she started to heal that piece, she was able to better lean into the ed tech, stuff with that. And so that's really a piece of what demoralization is. And but like you said, we have it's actually, I can explain why the culture things happen like they do. Part of the reason is because we as individuals have these things in our brain called mirror neurons. We're actually made to try to mirror the people we are around. That's our brain tries to do that because one of our goals is to try to fit into groups. We are an individual, but we also need to try to belong. We're social creatures. That's part of what our brain does. And so we have these mirror neurons. And so when we go into a building and we're there over time and we start to see people doing certain things or acting a certain way or being super positive or being super negative, we will start to act like those people. And it's because our brain is trying to make us fit in. So when you talk about it being sort of its own kind of pandemic, that's why it happens because we're trying to fit into that group no matter what we want to do, because our brain doesn't have our actual brain does not have a moral compass. It doesn't tell us whether it's positive or negative, we should or shouldn't do it. It's just
Mhm.
going to try to mimic people to fit in. And so that's why it's so important to be able to have those relationships in those buildings and be in a culture and climate that supports.
Yeah, I think there are potentially times where the culture of a uh, particular school building, say, particularly the negative culture of it, can be mistaken for the realities of the profession as a whole, right? I mean, there's a certain
Mm-hmm.
number, I don't know what the percentages are, but there's a certain significant percentage of teachers who have only taught in one school, right?
Yeah.
Certainly
Mm-hmm.
compared to people in other sectors of the workforce who may change their organization more frequently. And some of them may not realize that there are things that are just negative about the culture of their building, their
Yeah.
organization, that
Mhm.
may be completely different elsewhere.
Mhm.
But it makes a huge difference to understand
Mhm.
when there is an intentionality about the way that culture is created and set and built, and when there's some scaffolded leadership at different levels, right? And it passes on, and there's a real effort to that, which is the great opportunity that exists to create
Mhm.
that, but also the urgency of it. That it may be, again, contrasting it with other professions where somebody's unhappy in their company and they say, I need to go work somewhere else, not necessarily I need to find a completely different profession because every place is going to be the same. But I do think there is a feeling, because there are common issues and common challenges, right, that exist across the system, that the
Mhm.
way that you're made to feel in your environment
Mhm.
and the representation and your sense of hopefulness versus hopelessness and is can really be affected by that building level culture.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I would say building level culture. And this is one of those things where, like, one of the things that I have been talking about is our sense of what we have control over and what we don't. And sometimes I feel like we take on some of the societal issues as things we feel like we have control over or we should have control over, and we don't. And even those types of things, like the community that they're in and how, supportive or not supportive of the schools, people that are there. And that's not like a nod to any certain, you know, level of resources or anything like that. Like there are schools at all levels of communities that they're in that have a lot of support, like a lot of emotional support from the
Mhm.
community. And then there are schools that have a lot of stuff, but not a lot of emotional support from the community. So I think that even when we talk about climate and culture, we also have to think about that community space and the emotional things that are happening there, the emotional resources that are there, the support that is there, and then of course society at large and what we have as well. And so things we don't have control over but we may have influence over, but that can be really difficult as well if we're in a community with not a lot of emotional support, and we're trying to, as teachers, backfill the emotional support that's not there. And so that's also a place where we may be taking capacity that we just don't.
So Manny, I wanted to finish up with a note on self-care, and you referenced earlier sometimes it gets this bad rap, and but there's types and just facts about self-care that a lot of people may not be aware of or may not be thinking of, because it means a lot
Mhm.
of different things or a lot of different ways to go about it. Are there any of those that come to mind that you think are not always thought about or overlooked or misunderstood?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've laughed about a little bit when people have said, oh, self care, it was absolutely weaponized by some districts during the pandemic. 1000%. It was that if teachers just did self care, that they would be better and they would be healthier and things. And yet there, of course, wasn't anything taken off their plates, nothing changed. They were just expected to do extra. And that was wrong by what districts did. And ultimately, what a lot of districts did is it gave self care this kind of bad rap that people would say, and they were so sick of hearing it. They didn't want to, because it was used against them. Well, if you would just practice self care, then you would be better. But the reality is that self care is one of the ways that we heal. Taking care of ourselves, making sure that we have what we need, even as far as silly as things like going to the dentist and taking care of our health and trying to maybe not totally change your diet, but eat a little healthier from day to day. Like those are all things that are self care. And I think some of the pieces of self care that are overlooked, are the things that are more internal. And so if I said to a lot of people, tell me a self care practice, they might say running or yoga, or they usually go for the physical types of self care,
Mhm.
lifting weights, whatever it is. But I've actually said that there are 4 types of self-care. There's the physical, which again is the most common. There's also intellectual, which I think is very important for teachers. A lot of teachers enjoy intellectual stimulation. And so making sure that they're learning something outside of teaching is important. So whether that's just learning a new hobby, and it doesn't have to be something that's commercialized, it can be very inexpensive. It can be going out and identifying trees if that's what you like. Like it doesn't have to be something that you pay for. And we have spiritual, which is not necessarily a religion, but can be just centering yourself and understanding yourself a little bit better, what your purpose is, things like that. And then there's the emotional. And the emotional to me can be anything that makes you feel joy. So if that means that it is going and spending time with your mom on a Sunday, then that's what you do. If it's or any family member, a niece or nephew or whatever, then that's emotional self-care. If it makes you feel good, that's emotional self-care. And so those are the things that I think are often overlooked. We think it has to be something that is something we buy or something that we pay to do. And that's just really the commercialized side of self-care. I also think we have the things that are sort of backfilling our needs that we may be overlooking. For a long time, I felt, when I kind of started this journey, that I was keeping myself busy in order to really ignore some of the other issues I clearly had going on in my life. And so sometimes self care is about stopping and recognizing what's happening around you and trying to deal with some of those pieces that you have yet to deal with. And it wasn't until that moment that I started to heal from some of the other things that were happening in my life that were contributing to my disengagement. And so self-care it's important, and it's ignored by teachers because they're put in a place where a lot of their value is calculated, like they feel their value is calculated on how much they do for other people. And so that's the kind of something we need to get away from and start to help people understand that they're not valued based on how much they give to other people. Their value is there no matter how much they're giving to other people.
Yeah, and it would seem that there could be a reality where when your concerns about your profession, the things that are stressing you out, things you care about, your dedication to it, your lack of feeling as though you are any longer in control of the situation, right? That
Mm-hmm.
what takes the place of quote unquote self-care is more opportunities to be avoidant than to really
Mm-hmm.
it's like again, if I'm in working at a certain place and I'm just having such a rough time of it that I just decide I just need to go anywhere else just to not be
Mm-hmm.
here anymore. But I didn't really think about, well, what do I want? It's different. What would I like or what would be better?
Yeah.
Then I'm just
Mm-hmm.
pursuing some activity that's just anything but this, right? Take
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
mind off for a while, which in the long run is just not replenishing. It's not that
Right.
it's not understandable, but it's
Yep.
not necessarily going to be the same as doing whatever that activity is that refills some of that energy, some of that
Mm-hmm.
psychic energy that
Yeah.
is depleted and just feels like I chose this. This is what I decided to do because it meant something to me. And that's just a process of being able to take the time and think it through and for each
Mm-hmm.
person to determine what that is for them.
Yeah, exactly. 100% avoidance can be practiced in a lot of ways that are socially acceptable. You know, Drinking wine
Mhm.
is one of them. And I've nothing against people who drink wine, but like going home and having several glasses of wine can be an avoidance tactic that's used in order to avoid other things going on in their life. The thing I chose was something that was very socially acceptable. I worked, and I worked more and I worked more and I worked more. And it was only to avoid the other things that were happening in my life. But nobody would have said that because I was getting stuff done. I was being successful. I was doing all the things. And all it was an avoidance tactic. And so to be able to step back and really say, like, what am I putting energy into that really makes me feel good and is not, I'm not using as a way to avoid doing something else. Like that's so important. And like you said, to be able to then choose the thing, like that
Mhm.
is such a huge switch, to be able to choose the thing you're doing, to not sit on your phone and scroll through social media for hours, be able to choose to go outside and throw the ball to your dog or whatever it is. Like that's a huge shift.
Absolutely. So, listeners, you can learn more about the book Reignite the Flames and Mandy's other books at her website, mandyfroehlich.com, which we'll link below. Mandy, is there other stuff that people can learn about there or other things you're working on?
Yeah, actually, so I just got my certification in mental health first aid. So I'm super excited about that, to just add to some of the, strategies that we can use to help ourselves and others. I also have another book coming out with Solution Tree pretty soon. So I'm working on that. And it's actually due to right at midnight. So that's happening. And then I've been adding I just opened up kind of a Divergent University on my website as well, that people can find courses. I have a free self care course on there for educators. And I'm trying to add one course a month. And so those will be on there as
Excellent. Well, listeners, by the time you hear this, that book manuscript will have been submitted. You can wait a while for the book itself, but yeah, check out the website. Again, we'll link it below. We'll link Mandy's social media and have more information there. So check that out. If you're interested in any and all of these materials, please do also subscribe to The Authority for more in-depth author interviews like this one. We have a lot of great ones coming up. And please also visit bpodcast.network to learn about all of our 30 plus shows. So thank you all for listening, and thanks, Mandy, for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
This has been the Authority Podcast, hosted by Ross Romano, edited by Gage Sanderson.
Do you want to simplify your school's technology, save teachers time, and improve students' performance on state assessments? You can do it all, but don't waste another minute. Head straight to ixl.com/BE to learn how IXL's research proven teaching and learning platform can help you achieve all of these goals. That's IXL.com/BE.